Developed by Square between 1993 and 1995, Chrono Trigger is an epic JRPG with a turn-based combat system and a deeply immersive story, full of engaging characters and incredibly detailed world building, with a map that can be explored in different historical eras. This game, which has obtained great fame and prestige among today's retro gamers, has always been extremely popular since its release. Square was able to produce many legendary titles, exclusively on Nintendo consoles, during the 16-bit war with Sega, taking on a dominant role in the JRPG genre, a role that has been able to maintain and consolidate to this day. The game is designed by a team that at the time was advertised as the Dream Team. Among others, Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, and manga author Akira Toriyama. This collaboration already says a lot. The project was not born only as game design, but as a state-of-the-art narrative world building. I'm Steve, welcome to POST-LUDENS, and today we're going to look at the context and game design philosophy behind the creation of Chrono Trigger, a Square masterpiece, and how this developer's mindset reflects the attitude and cultural approach to video game development in Japan. Understanding why Chrono Trigger still has such a great reputation among players who played it at the time and retro game enthusiasts today is simultaneously easy in some ways but more complex in others. Surely, if we say that the game was developed by a mixed team of designers who were already legendary at the time and by new names who became. So thanks to the work on this title is a good start. Then, we can add that the game, although it was not revolutionary compared to other Square titles released in the years immediately before, such as Secret of Mana and Final Fantasy VI, still represents the peak of gaming perfection on this console. The pixel art style graphics are gorgeous and offer highly cinematic moments. The music, although limited to arrangements with highly compressed sounds in 16 bits, has an orchestrality and an emotional thematic development that perfectly emphasizes all the moments of games, raising them to a real experience of involvement for the player, and that stucks in your memory forever. The story does not amaze for its sheer complexity or depth, but has a plot and a narrative rhythm that are simply perfect, and invites the player not only to complete the game to 100%, explore every corner of the maps of each narrative segment, complete every side quest and every possible dialogue with the secondary characters and other NPCs. But it then also offers the Game Plus mode for the first time in the history of video games and allows the player to explore multiple endings, making different moral choices at different moments of the plot. Thanks to this series of features, the game was a huge success from the first weeks of sales, remaining the best-selling game in Japan for this console, surpassing equally legendary titles such as Super Mario Bros. 3, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, Castlevania, Final Fantasy VI, and Mega Man, among others. With a team of over 40 designers and 20 programmers, Square was at the peak of its ability at the time and produced games whose development was so complex and articulated that no developer of the time would have been able to imitate. The Square titles of the time are milestones of gaming perfection for the SNES. Chrono Trigger is such a graphically dense game with such a rich and long story that Nintendo had to use cartridges containing literally twice as much storage memory as ordinary cartridges to distribute the game. The involvement of legendary designers and new and emerging names of great talent represents Square's internal desire to artistically surpass itself and create a game that totally represents the vision of a fully immersive epic world, which the artistic team has been struggling to obtain for years, using each subsequent title they developed as an experiment to expand their technical skills. With Secret of Mana, a 1993 action strategy, JRPG, they came very close, with incredibly artistic pixel art graphics and a game system with innovative hybrid mechanics. But evidently, behind the scenes, the developers were still not completely satisfied, because for the development of Chrono Trigger, they pushed the skills of their team of artists and programmers and even the technical capabilities of the console to the highest levels from all points of view. If we go deeper into the development mindset of Chrono Trigger, a divergence between the philosophy of Shigeru Miyamoto and the Legend of Zelda series clearly emerges. It is not a clear rupture, but a bifurcation starting from a common matrix. Miyamoto builds compact and systemic worlds according to the principle of akoniwa, the miniature garden. The game world is a coherent structure, almost a mechanism. Every element is legible. Every space is designed to be explored and understood. In this context, the protagonist Link not so much a character as an interface. It is the player's access point to a perfectly calibrated gaming system. Square's approach moves in another direction. In titles like Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, and the Final Fantasy series, the world is not a model to be deciphered, but an epic to be traversed. It is not closed, but excessive. It continually suggests something that exists beyond the limits of the player's experience. The narrative takes on an almost cosmological dimension, and time travel in Chrono Trigger becomes the tool through which this surplus is made perceptible. The world exists before, during, and after the player. The distinction can be summarized as follows. Miyamoto builds spaces to interact with. Square builds eras to explore. In the context of console war, these two philosophies are mainly developed around the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, while Sega, with the Genesis, maintains a more akin approach. Greater emphasis on responsiveness, speed, and immediate performance. Even in its JRPGs, such as Phantasy Star 4, there is a tendency towards more direct and less expansive structures than those of the Square philosophy. In the end, an interesting triangle emerges. Nintendo defines the video game as perfect gaming system. Square turns it into an interactive mythological epic. Sega maintains it as a performative and immediate experience with an almost arcade approach. It is within this tension that Chrono Trigger finds its definitive form. Not a simple role-playing game, but a narrative world that exceeds its boundaries and invites the player to cross it as a witness to a story bigger than himself.
On the JRPG front, the Sega Genesis never really managed to compete with Square's offer on Super Nintendo in those years. However, some relevant titles helped define an alternative identity for the genre on the Sega platform. The Phantasy Star series represents the most significant case, with Phantasy Star 4, 1993 in Japan, 1995 in the West, which offered a more compact and direct narrative than the Square epics, but still rich in world building and science fiction themes. Other titles such as Shining Force 2 and Beyond Oasis showed a more hybrid approach between strategy, action, and RPG, highlighting how Sega experimented with less canonical forms of the genre. In the United States, at the same time, the console market was undergoing a phase of redefinition. After being rebuilt in the 1980s by Nintendo, the industry was now moving towards more mature and technologically advanced experiences. The arrival of the Sony PlayStation in 1995 in North America marked a paradigm shift. 3D graphics, a more adult target, and a communication less related to childhood than previous generations. In this context, the JRPG still remained a relatively niche genre for Western audiences, but it was laying the foundations for future global expansion. If in Japan, titles such as Chrono Trigger represented the apex of a consolidated narrative and symbolic tradition, in the United States, the video game medium was increasingly oriented towards simulation, action, and technological innovation. Two different trajectories, destined to converge in the following years in the form of open worlds and large global narrative productions.
Square games from the 90s, from the Final Fantasy series to Secret of Mana, share a precise philosophy. The player enters a world that already has history, religions, conflicts, and internal mythologies. For Square, the game doesn't have to contain the entire world, but it can create immersion by showing only a large fragment of the larger story. This produces a very particular effect. The player perceives that the narrative universe is much larger than the adventure he is living. This is a narrative tradition that is deeply rooted in Asian culture. In the great literary cycles of East Asia, for example, the classic novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, or the various Japanese monogatari, stories of dynasties and gods, the narrative never follows a single isolated hero. It tells the story of entire generations, factions, empires, historical cycles. The world appears as a historical organism much vaster than the single adventure. In this sense, Square introduces a form of serial epic into video games. Not an individual journey into a symbolic space, but a saga that crosses eras, civilizations, and genealogies. These worlds function as sophisticated forms of narrative escapism, immersion in autonomous symbolic universes, worlds that reflect reality but at the same time build a coherent alternative reality. Chrono Trigger takes this principle to the extreme with time travel. The player doesn't just explore a world, they explore the history of that world. Prehistory, Middle Ages, future, apocalypse. Every era is a chapter of the same mythology. In Chrono Trigger, the map of the game world is the same in every chapter. But each chapter of the game is a different era of civilization, so the map itself, but also the enemies, the secondary characters, the NPCs, appear drastically different every time. And later in the game, you have the option to move freely between these scenarios. Even the secondary characters, the companions of Chrono, the silent protagonist used by the player, change a lot during the story. They undergo real psychological transformations, and some even change their names as a testimony of their change. Their side quests, interactions, and use in battle leads the player to create parasocial relationships with these characters.
In the Western context of the early 90s, the video game developed along partly divergent lines compared to Japanese JRPGs. On PC platforms, titles such as Ultima 7, The Black Gate aim to build coherent simulation worlds where every element, objects, NPCs, economic systems obeys verifiable internal logics. The player does not go through a predefined narrative, but interacts with a complex system that reacts to his actions, like is typical of a sandbox, simulated 3D arena game. At the same time, games like Doom or Quake introduce a different form of immersion, based on three-dimensional spatiality and physical presence in the game world. Here, the priority is not the construction of a narrative epic, but the intensity of the immediate experience and the perceptive credibility of the environment. That is why the preferred form for the camera point of view was the first-person perspective, to enhance the perceived tridimensional spatiality of the immersion. Overall, Western development at the time favored simulation, responsiveness, and systemic coherence. The game world tends to be conceived as an environment to test, or a system to dominate, rather than a mythology to inhabit. This difference in approach marks a fundamental distinction from the narrative and symbolic philosophy of Japanese JRPGs.
The philosopher Johann Huizinga in Homo Ludens argues that culture is born within play spaces. Law, ritual war, poetry, myth, even politics emerge in what he calls the magic circle, a separate symbolic zone where human beings experience roles, rules, and meanings. It is not a total escape from reality, but a temporary suspension of its logic, in which the player can act according to new symbolic structures. Video games, and JRPGs in particular, expand this concept. The circle is no longer just an abstract space, but an entire habitable world, with its own geography, history, and mythology, in which the player enters and actively participates. The anthropologist Richard Dawkins introduces the concept of memes in his controversial The Selfish Gene. The idea is simple but powerful. Ideas behave like cultural replicators. They spread, mutate, compete, and survive in people's minds, a bit like genes in biology. A meme can be an image, symbol, story, or concept that spreads among people, changes over time, and competes with other content to be remembered and replicated. In this sense, the narrative worlds of video games are particularly fertile environments for the spread of memes. Archetypes, characters, and symbols are rooted in the collective imagination and continue to live even outside the game itself, contributing to the construction of real shared cultural realities. Japanese science fiction writer Satoshi Ito thinked that language can be interpreted as a self-replicating system, almost independent of the individuals who use it. In his works, words, narrative structures, and communicative codes are not simple tools or manifestations of the human mind, but entities that spread, transform, and impose themselves through society, shaping the very way in which reality is perceived and organized. In this sense, language is not only a means to describe the world, but a force that contributes to building it, a sort of symbiosis between man and language. This vision resonates with Richard Dawkins' concept of memes. Just as ideas replicate and evolve within culture, language can also be seen as a dynamic ecosystem of forms that survive because they are continuously reused and reinterpreted. Narrative worlds, including video game worlds, then become spaces in which these self-replicating systems manifest themselves with particular evidence. Symbols, archetypes, and linguistic structures spread, settle, and end up living beyond the single text or experience, contributing to the formation of shared symbolic realities. Finally, I want to quote again the postmodernist philosopher Jean Baudrillard with his theory of simulacra. In modern post-industrial societies, systems of signs become so complex as to generate self-sufficient symbolic realities. If we put these tools together in the same scheme, something interesting emerges. The human being lives simultaneously on 3 levels. 1. The biological is made of genes, instincts, survival, and instinctive behavior. 2. The cultural sphere, in which self-replicants such as memes, languages, ideas contribute to construct reality and meaning. 3. And finally, the symbolic playable circle in which we create arenas, game worlds, myths, narratives to surround ourselves and live the social life. Huizinga explains the device: play as an experimental space of culture. Dawkins, on the other hand, explains the evolutionary dynamics. Ideas and languages compete and replicate each other. Baudrillard explains the extreme result of this system: symbolic structures that become autonomous realities. If human culture is a large structure of mimetic symbolic interactions, then many historical eras appear strikingly similar. Technologies change, but the mechanism under the surface remains the same. Humans are continually creating cultural play spaces. These are systems of moral or behavioral values like religions, myths, sports, and perhaps video games. Replicating ideas like dogmas, concepts, doctrines, narratives, symbols, signs, rituals, shared symbolic realities, cosmologies, ideologies, narrative universes, pantheons, political structures. The ancients built the cosmos of the gods. Modern societies construct nations, ideologies, or media universes. The cognitive structure that produces these systems does not change. It's the need of human beings to project their own interpretation of things onto reality. The mind creates structures, so reality must also be a structure. In this sense, this intuition is also close to that of the famous psychiatrist and philosopher Carl Jung and his idea of collective unconscious. Certain symbolic forms reappear because they derive from deep structures of the human mind. If we remove the technological and industrial trajectory from the picture, humanity seems to repeat the same pattern over and over again in every era. Man observes the world, then builds symbolic models. Those transform into myths, religions, games, or ideologies. Man finally gets to live inside those models, and the circle repeats. And here we come to the connection with the video games we are studying. Applied to JRPGs like Chrono Trigger, the concept gets interesting. Square's worlds don't try to mimic the real world. They are autonomous symbolic worlds with internal history, geography, and mythology. They are simulacra in the Baudrillardian sense, universes that function independently of their real referent. Chrono Trigger therefore becomes something more than a great JRPG. It is one of the first examples of a simulacral world fully realized in the video game medium. A self-sufficient narrative universe that exists, at least symbolically, even when the player turns off the console. A JRPG like Chrono Trigger is not just entertainment. It is a playable, mimetic ecosystem, a symbolic world where archetypes, myths, and narratives compete for the player's attention. In other words, we are looking at a modern phenomenon, the development of a video game, with tools of cultural anthropology. The video game becomes the latest evolution of a very ancient practice, creating playable, symbolic universes. The interesting thing is that Chrono Trigger, as a video game, depicts exactly this reality of human existence, showing us the world in different eras and different phases of its civilization. But by removing technological progress from the focus of the narrative, the social contrast, the disparities, the impulses, and the way of dealing with them always remain the same in each society. It is no coincidence that our protagonists are warriors from all eras who have in common only one type of specific charisma, the ability and courage to solve problems with the sword. Of course, the game sometimes encourages, through some minigames or with methods of recovering important objects and problem solving, to think outside the box and find alternative paths. But already in old games like this one, we observe the phenomenon of ludonarrative dissonance, which today hunts most of the AAA titles in every generation of consoles. In the story, there is never any reference to the fact that the protagonist leaves behind a mountain of corpses. Chrono and his friends never hesitate for a second to draw their swords and solve everything with violence. One could almost say that here there is no dissonance. Indeed, the silence in front of the carnage caused by Kronos and his teenage friends is only silenced, but left intact as a presence in the foreground of the narrative. Now, I'm not sure if this was the message intentionally conceived by the creators of the game. Maybe we can imagine sword fights as a metaphor for conflict in a broader sense. What I'm saying is that using our scheme, it emerges that in the world of Chrono Trigger, some memes are predominant in all historical eras. War, the sword, courage, heroism, personal transformation. The game shows all this well, but it is also metatextual because it also chooses to adhere perfectly to the human paradigm of creating meaning within a mimetic space of signs, the hyper-reality of the video game. In a way, Chrono Trigger is a game world, created in the image of the real world to talk about how the real world works. Put this way, it sounds a banality like art imitates life. In reality, the square vision is more precise, almost mechanical. Chrono Trigger is not simply a world that resembles the real world. It is an operational model of the world, a kind of narrative laboratory where certain fundamental dynamics are isolated, simplified, and made observable. Maybe I'm reading too much into just this game, but I think Chrono Trigger is the perfect example to refer to all JRPGs, even modern ones, and MMOs. Perhaps the key point in Chrono Trigger is time. The game does not represent just a space, but a temporal structure. Causes, effects, historical cycles, collapses, rebirths. Time travel is not just a narrative device. It is a way of making visible something that in reality we perceive only in a fragmentary way. The fact that actions propagate, that civilizations emerge and decay, that the present is always a node within a wider network. In this sense, the game does something very close to what in science we would call a simplified model, like a simulation. It does not reproduce the world realistically, but it does capture some of its structural rules. Jean Baudrillard also fits in well here, but with an interesting nuance. The world of Chrono Trigger is a simulacrum, yes, but not in the sense of pure empty illusion. It is a simulacrum that functions as a device of understanding, a hyper-reality that clarifies instead of hiding. And at the same time, returning to Johann Huizinga, it is a particularly sophisticated magic circle, a play space in which the player experiences not only game mechanics, but patterns of the world. Chrono Trigger does not represent the world. It builds a world to make his structures visible. And here there is a small, almost philosophical twist. When you enter that world, you're not just escaping reality. You are looking at a reduced, readable, almost debugged version of the way the world works. Time, causality, destiny, contingency. A toy, yes, but a toy that teaches how the mechanism works. The human being does not live only in material reality. It also lives in the symbolic realities it produces. From myths of the gods to literary epics to contemporary interactive worlds and video games, human culture is a continuous construction of spaces where ideas, symbols, and stories can be experienced. The tools change. The mechanism remains surprisingly ancient. The video game, after all, could only be the most technologically advanced form of something that humanity has always done, playing with its myths to understand the world. That's it for today, folks. If you made it this far, thank you for your attention. You are surely passionate gamers like myself. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps the channel grow. every opinion is useful in making a conversation about the important and often underestimated topic of what video games really are. Bye.
This video was released in the net with the consent and supervision of the Autocratic Body for Information and Public Opinion in the year 2080. We hope to have entertained you and made you a little interested in what's behind the veil of old interactive media. See you again in the next episode. Bye bye.